Good evening, everyone. We are going to get started. First, I just want to do a couple of housekeeping and a little bit of what the evening's going to look like. This is being live streamed on Facebook. And those who have questions, we have to give you the mic so the people on Facebook can hear. And in saying that, questions we're going to save to the end. Sheryl and Chad would like them to save to the end of both their presentations. Chad is going to go first, and then we'll take 5 minutes in case anyone has to step outside or go to the washroom, and then Sheryl will do her presentation. And I think that's it. Anyone online who has a question, I'll be following it on my phone. So if you have a question, you can type it into the chat, and we'll make sure that we can get the question asked. And it was noted that if the answer, if Chad or Sheryl doesn't know the answer, we'll write the question down, and we'll get an answer to you. And so just before we get started with Chad, I just want to, I'm not going to do a formal opening, but I just want to say chimigwech to everyone for coming out tonight. And earlier I had taken out a feast plate, and because we're talking about our ancestors tonight, and I wanted to make sure that we acknowledge them, and also that we ask them to come into the room with us and join us and help us to learn more. And when we think about our past and how much it really does affect who we are today and our future, it's always an honor to learn more. And Chad and I actually had the opportunity to go to Black River, New York this past, well, I guess last year now. And it was asked that over COVID, a lady from Black River had been in contact with me, and she had a book called Castorland Journals, and she read about the Mississauga man who was in this journal, and it was recorded. And so she found through the internet, she found Mississaugas of Rice Lake and Hiawatha, and that's how we got to meet with that woman in that community. And Chad did the very similar presentation there, and I spoke about our community a little bit past, present, and Chad gave the greater history of the Mississauga Nation. So it's a wonderful presentation. I know I heard Sheryl's many years ago, so there's much more now, I'm sure. And I just want to say chimigwech to both Sheryl and Chad for doing this tonight. I think it's really important that we do these types of evenings or days and continue to do this and pass that information down to our little ones. So chimigwech, thank you, and we are grateful to have you both here. Thank you.
Everyone can hear me? Okay. So I'm going to, as Lori was mentioning, I'm going to kind of give a general overview of the history of some of our community, but also the other 5 Mississauga communities, and therefore the Mississauga Nation as a whole. So this relates to the fact that I have been working as a researcher for the 6 communities since October of 2020 as well. Next. If you see me start talking, it's not on the screen anymore, please remind me to say next, so that way I can remind Eugene. So the outline for my presentation today, I'm going to do a little bit of a land acknowledgement. We all know which territory we're on. Give an introduction, because there's some people here that I don't know and who probably don't know me. I've been out of territory up until August of 2024, starting in, well, since 2004 pretty much I was out of the territory. Just moved back when I started working at the University of Toronto. So I'll do a land acknowledgement introduction. What is the role of, what is the research role that I hold? A general overview of the research I've done from October 2020 till now. And then just talk about research interviews and in-community, a list of resources to date, important agreements, treaties, and land surrenders and purchases. And I'll talk a little bit about Anishinaabe, because that's another thing that I'm doing while doing this research, is all the literature that I'm going through, all the interviews, I'm keeping track of words that have been used or that have been said in these recorded interviews I'm doing. And then just kind of go over some of my general findings to date. Conclusion, I'll have my contact information at the end if any of you decide to reach out to me. There are some people in this room that are on a list that I've had since I started that I want to interview. Again, as I said, I came back to the territory. I just live in Oshawa now in August. And when I started this position, as we know, it was in the middle of COVID. So there's a nice, strong, not able to travel between provinces. And I was in Quebec prior to this, so I couldn't actually do some of the stuff without doing it online. So, as we know, we are currently situated here on Mississauga Nishnabeg territory, so I'm glad to be here with you on our territory. Next slide, sorry. Thanks, Dan. Ani Chadin Dishnakaz, Pamadashka Dayang and Dunjaba, Montreal, Oshawa, Megwadota, Atikdodam. So as I was saying, my name is Chad Cowie. I am from this community. Pamadashka Dayang is the name that has been brought forth through a lot of literature that I've reviewed for the territory we are currently here, the community we are here in. I'm part of the Caribou clan, and as I said, I currently live in Oshawa. My background, so not only am I doing this for our communities, but I got my undergrad in political science and First Nations studies at the University of Western Ontario, my master's degree in political studies at the University of Manitoba, and I'm currently finishing up my PhD at the University of Alberta. I'm waiting for my defense date. I'm very close to being done after 10 years. And I'm an assistant professor at the University of Toronto in political science, where I do a lot of Indigenous politics. So this kind of relates a lot to that area of focus, because that's how I bridge between Western political science and then talking about our own nations and our own governance structures. Next slide. At this point in time, Terry Lynn is no longer my research assistant, but I do want to give her a shout out because of the work that she had helped me do while in the role. So between October of 2020 until the end of March of 2023, I was doing some work. I had a research assistant. Terry Lynn is from Mississauga First Nation, our most northern community. So she helped quite a bit with doing research and interviews, especially up in our northern part of our territory. So I do want to give her a shout out because she was helping up until the end of March. And I wanted to highlight that because a lot of the stuff that I'm going to be introducing and talking about, as well as the interviews I'll talk about, could not have been done without her assistance from the northern part of our territory. Oh, sorry, next slide. Oh, wait. Back one. Sorry. So in regards to what the researcher's current role is, so part of my job, alongside the other stuff that I do, is to provide support to our communities, our chief and councils, in relation to the work that I'm trying to compile and put together. Seek information, resources, and understanding on past and present existence of us as a nation and our communities. It's to include the knowledge from you guys as citizens of our nation and from our communities, and make sure that that information is shared to you guys in the future. So you'll understand what I mean by this when I talk about all my resources. I just did a count on this a couple of days. It's actually a big list that I have, and it's still growing. And to seek to make sure the knowledge obtained from this research project will be available not only for those of us today, but those to come. So that way, obviously, our citizens and our communities know more about who we are. Because obviously, for a lot of us, we may not have been able to have this information growing up. It may have been denied to us. We're trying to make sure to rectify that going forward. And then the logo over here. Oh, we're ahead. Okay, one sec. There we go. So part 3, general overview of research work. So as I said, I began this role thanks to Lori. Lori suggested me they were looking for a researcher back in 2020. My name got suggested because of my work already, being an academic and doing a lot of work bridging Indigenous politics, nation rebuilding, and bringing in that to especially my field of political science. So I started this during COVID, so a lot of stuff was online and having to be able to sift what was electronically available. So I have a long list of things I want to do in regards to going through archives in some places, such as in Ottawa, but as well as in other locations. So part of my job at the time when I started this was to meet with our coordinators. Kim Muskrat, who's here, was our coordinator for Hiawatha at the time, so I would be working with her, and there was a coordinator in most communities at the time. And then I'd meet with the chiefs as well to go over stuff, do presentations to them, obtain resources and literature. Amazon Books thinks that I'm a bookstore now because of this. And then do interview with knowledge holders. And when we talk about knowledge holders is different from elders. There are elders who have knowledge, but then there are also knowledge holders who are younger than what we would consider an elder. So I usually use Caleb Musgrave as an example here. Between him and I, if there was an apocalypse tomorrow, he is more useful than I am because he actually understands our territory and I don't. I will go crawl into a hole and die. And then on top of this, doing in-community research like I'm doing here with you today, and gathering of material and notes. So this is, again, collecting things, putting things together, and hopefully eventually most of it will be able to be available electronically going forward. Oh, next slide, okay. So in regards to in-community research work that I'm talking about, so part of it is to meet and learn from the citizens of our communities in order to gather that information, past, present, and future, to obtain perspectives and views from citizens and members from different clans, families, expertise, and from different components that we are. There are lists that some people in our community will give, but by talking to people, I'll hear names from them from not only our own community, but in other places as well. So my list is very robust. I don't like following a specific list because there's a lot of us who have information, and sometimes our communities may not know that person has more information or have documents to look at. And to weave together that history, that shared history from the 6 communities. When I talk about the interviews coming forward in a bit, there's little pieces from the interviews I've done so far. Everyone has said the same thing. So it's been interesting, and I've interviewed people from 5 of the 6 communities so far. So there's little parts that actually interweave, and a lot of our family trees connect. So I hope to maybe use a wall eventually to be able to figure that out, because they go back and forth between the communities until we weren't allowed to properly travel between them from like the 1920s on, when they kind of barred us from moving without permission. And then so of course to highlight and to showcase and highlight our existence during and prior to settler contact, or prior to contact and with settler societies as well. So this is the form that we had designed. So what the form does is just says that, a person has agreed to allow me to interview them. It's usually recorded, whether it is done over video or Zoom, or by recording through just the voice. And this way that it will be available for future generations in our communities, but also so that way I can get it transcribed and make sure to follow what's being said. And to make sure I'm not missing some of the words that are used, and making sure that it is in a written form as well. Currently, the process I use, it's not very good with Anishinaabe-Mowin. One of my interviews that I've done, when she said her name in Anishinaabe-Mowin, it translated in English to "I bury the body." Yeah. So getting help with that is very key going forward when we're doing that, to make sure it's translated properly and that we know that it actually represents the actual name that it's supposed to. Next slide. So one of my first interviews I did was with our chief back in early January 2021. This is obviously from Zoom. Yeah, January 26, 2021. So when I'm doing these interviews and I approach them, my key thing was to make sure my questions were general, because I want you guys to be able to talk with me. I don't want to pigeonhole you into specific ways of answering, because that way I can find those things that weave together things. So my main 6 questions that I ask are: who are your parents, grandparents? Who are your ancestors? Where are you from? What can you tell us about the community you're from? What can you tell us about the overall nation? What are the differences you have seen growing up, not only from your own timeline, but also what you might have heard from your parents and your grandparents growing up? And can you recall or discuss any key major events that have occurred, not only for the community, but the nation as well? So in a lot of these questions, things come up. There's a lot of interconnection, especially with the last 2 that are very interesting that I've seen from interviews. So in regards to the interviews, what can I say? Well, I've done over 65 of them now. Hopefully after this weekend, I will have that number higher as well. All 65, other than 3 of them, they've all been from the communities except for Scugog so far. Hopefully I'll be fixing that in the next couple of months. But they have been done from Alderville, Mississaugas of the Credit, Mississauga 8 up north, Curve Lake, and here in Hiawatha. And the age range has gone from early 30s into their 80s. Regards to my resource list, and you get to see just a little bit of a thing, a little bit of a clip of it. As of a couple days ago, over 350 different pieces of literature that exists. This includes 101 books, edited books, chapters from books that even mention Mississauga. 60 news articles so far, over 50 journal articles. 21 pieces on treaties and surrenders, and obviously that will grow as I'm going through more information. 59 other government documents, so this includes anything from city to federal to provincial stuff, as well as even some of our own Indigenous organizations. I have about 17 film recordings and maps. I have 8 dissertations that focus on the Mississauga that I've come across. And then on top of that, which I keep mostly privately because I'm not allowed to really share some of them, over about 80 community documents between 4 of the communities out of the 6 so far I've been able to have access to. And that's only a little bit. So for instance, here in Hiawatha, in our archives, I've gotten through 1.5 boxes, and there's still a lot more to go through. So over 350 sources that talk about us. When I first started this position and started doing the research, I did not realize it would get that high. And I have not read all of them or gone through all of them, obviously. Next slide. So an example here, obviously, there's some of the literature here. Resources yet to be assessed include government documents. Again, I'm hoping to get up to Ottawa. There are archives there, Indian Affairs, or Crown Indigenous Relations we'll call now. Hopefully get up there to go through that because there are some things that they have up there that would be good to go through. There's also community files and hard copy of archives that I want to continue going through, especially with the 2 communities where I haven't had access yet. For some of you guys, family documents. I'm very curious to see some of those because of what's kept in that and to be able to go forward with that and include it properly because it will relate some stories to what I've already heard from some of our presentation. Church documents. Our church here had kept records. Other churches and other communities kept very strong records that are very important in regards to the history of our families, but also the development of our communities. The Methodist Church, through the New England Company, was a key component of formulating not only Hiawatha, but also Curve Lake, the Credit, Scugog, and Alderville. And actually, when I did archives at Peterborough in December, I found the book, the little Methodist book that they had where they recorded and noted forming Hiawatha and the other ones. They had a copy of it. And then there's some institutional and city and town documents I want to go through. So I'm currently in the process of setting up appointments with Mississauga, the city of Mississauga. I went through some of the stuff here in Peterborough, but also there's archives at Trent and the University of Toronto that talk about our communities that I'm trying to get access to. And then as I've been doing this, out of those 350 sources, I have on my computer about 3 different lists of other literature that I need to go through because doing this, automatically I have to go look at the works cited that each piece has done, and then they have more in there. So I still have to go through a couple of pages of documents that I have to go through what sources they have suggested and find them. Next. So when we talk about important agreements and purchases, well, not only does this include things like the Williams Treaty and the Rice Lake Purchase, but it also includes various ones that we've been a part of. Most of Southern Ontario has had Mississauga people at the signing of these surrenders or treaties, but we also can go before that. We have the Dish with the One Spoon Treaty. We are in agreement with that with some of the Haudenosaunee. We also have agreements like this in relations with the Wendat. Not only that, but also our own agreements within our own confederation, because when we're talking about the Anishinaabe, we're also talking about Algonquin, Odawa, we're talking about Chippewa, we're talking about us as Mississauga as well. And then we have to look at some more agreements that allow for the settlement of Haudenosaunee or some of the Wendat into this area. There's obviously a conflict going on when we talk about territoriality between these nations with ours and the rest of the Anishinaabe, especially following the American Revolution. And then we have obviously wampum belts that they're not just a Haudenosaunee thing. You see wampums used by most of the East Coast nations, and we have agreements that exist with the Sioux. We have agreements with the Cree. We have agreements with the Wabanaki Confederacy further out east. It's just trying to see what some of these are and get the people and being able to talk with some of the people who have this oral history. Because it does exist. It's just being able to access the right information, the right people to be able to further look into it. Next. So, as I said earlier, one of the other aspects of this is as I'm going through this work, some of the literature dates right into the 1700s, late 1600s, depending on who's writing about it, French, English. So when we look up the word Mississauga, I've documented, I think, 8 different spellings of it so far that you see in the literature. So when doing this, I was asked to also keep track of any words that reference us in our language, as well as how it is said in English or French. And this is obviously a work in progress. It's always ongoing, but I've broken it down into 3 categories. Next. So I have general words, which could be anywhere from what we might call a month to, referring to caribou or how the snow might settle in a specific area or the ice freezing over. Then I have individual and nationalities. So when we talk about Anishinaabe words, the way when we translate the Anishinaabe word for American, it means people with the long knives. So just going along and making sure that I'm getting the English translation alongside our own word. But the problem with this sometimes is our own word can be spelt in 3 or 4 different ways and phonetically said differently depending on the nation that we're talking about and which area. So although some of these words may not be specifically the Mississauga dialect, they're still Anishinaabe. And on top of that, the other one is place names. So when going through this information, we know that there's a lot of parts of what we call Southern Ontario that are labeled through Haudenosaunee words or Wendat words. Well, we had words and names for those places as well. So it's keeping track of those going through, everything from Pamadashkadang, which refers to where Hiawatha is, to Oshkigamog, which is what Curves Lake name is, as well as what Toronto's called, the Humber River, and so on. So I've been keeping a track of this, and every month I get to update it and send it to the chiefs. Next. So besides looking at the language, these are some of the areas, the general findings that I have gone through so far, and I'll touch briefly on them while talking with you guys, because we could be here forever if I wanted to go through everything. So this is how I'm going to break down going into some of the general findings. Just who we are in regards to being Mississauga, a little bit about carrying places, we talk about diplomacy, relations with the Huron, the Beaver Wars, and the encroachment period, because when I refer to it by the encroachment period is this period where we see upheaval for our nation. There's a lot of contestation that's going on. Methodism and the Church of England, and I say and Catholicism, because at the same time you see by the 1830s, mostly by 1840, you see the 3 religions, the 3 aspects of Christianity pitted against each other in regards to our communities. And there's a reason why it's done this way. The Badger Commission and relocation, or the push for the relocation, and how this goes alongside what we see some correspondence from some of our chiefs during this time from 1830s to 1880s. And a little bit of talking of what has been coming in some literature that I've gotten to on gendered and two-spirited roles within our society. Next. So when we talk about the Mississauga, we're referred to as coastal people who tend to follow the waterways. We followed the mouths of river. We made camp there because we fished salmon. So literally our translation refers to us fishing salmon. This is also why a lot of our treaties are signed in the spring and fall, because we'd be at the mouth of the river harvesting the salmon, and that's how they knew we would be there. We obviously trap beaver, harvest sap, and so on. Our traditional territory, if you're looking at a map for the Mississauga specifically, goes from, well, it stretches across most of present-day southern and central Ontario, from Brockville up towards Sault Ste. Marie and Sudbury, as well as down towards Niagara Falls around Hamilton. And if you look at where some of our communities are, they're in the outer edges of what our traditional territory is. We also have shared territory with other Anishinaabe nations. So again, like I said, the Algonquin, the Potawatomi, the Odawa, and the Chippewa, when we take into consideration the overall territory, our confederacy goes from what we would call Western Quebec through most of Ontario, through southern Manitoba, into the Dakotas, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Minnesota. Quite a big tract of territory. And then obviously parts of that territory would be blended because we shared it. The idea of owning territory was obviously not something we followed, so it was more about sharing and being sustainable and being able to hold oneself. So when we talk about, that's why when we see some of the contestation between the Haudenosaunee and the Huron here, because there are oral history that talks about us allowing them to come live amongst us for protection, or in the case where we have agreed to allow them to utilize the resources on the territory. Not necessarily own the territory or trade over the territory, because we didn't look at it that way as being owner, we were stewards of it. So when we talk about stuff like the dish with the spoon treaty, some will try to say that that meant that we were sharing the entire territory and therefore all the resource, while others will say, well, no, it was being allowed to do it, but they still had to follow our diplomacy and still had to come and ask us, come smoke the pipe, request to be able to come in. If they didn't do that, whatever they tried to take in the territory had to be given back, especially if they were caught. This goes alongside with trading with different nations, not just the British and French, but we obviously know there's been a long history of being able to trade as far west as the prairies, up through to the Hudson Bay, and then down all the way to the Gulf of Mexico. So our trade networks were a lot stronger, but trying to look further into this, there's more research that needs to be done and fully looked, and some of the information I now have does go into some of this, but I haven't had a chance to get into those pieces of material yet. So in regards to the carrying places, there's quite a few key carrying places, and so far I've understood that there are 4 that are very specific to us as Mississauga. Toronto's one of them, Scugog is one of them. I haven't been able to get into the full details for the Toronto one. It's very vast. Scugog, I've only read one component of it. I know there's one along the Trent 7 waterway as well, or what becomes the Trent 7 waterway. There's a reason why they build it through there. But these are obviously very important routes for us, not just for trading, but for traveling and being able to connect through the rest of our nation. And not only that, but through the rest of our confederacy. They still exist today, and we see these as roads that have been put in place over top of some of these paths that are on the land, while we see obviously things like the Trent 7 waterway built along the waterways. So they are not new, it's not founded by other people. We use them always, it's just they saw that and utilized it for themselves as well. Next. So what we see sometimes when we're talking and hearing about how Indigenous people related to the British and French is this idea of them giving us gifts. Well, the gifts are part of diplomacy. It is kind of a sense of how they would, the gifts were supposed to go alongside being able to renew it. So when we hear about some of these treaties, some of these wampums that existed in the past, they would go about telling that it would be a couple of days of experience where they would be doing these treaties, these wampums. And alongside that, they would be retelling stories of previous wampums because it would be renewing them. But on top of renewing them, it went alongside that you still gave gifts because that was a part of the transaction and part of renewing or establishing a new treaty, a new diplomatic relationship. We continued that obviously with the French and British. They knew that. They practiced that well until 1830 with us. So the gifts were not payment, and they are not necessarily a sign of us agreeing to be subordinate, but rather they are a part of our way of doing diplomacy and renewing that relationship. This is not only important to consider when we're talking about our surrenders or our treaties or agreements with the British or with Canada, but also with other nations such as the Iroquois, the Haudenosaunee, as well as what we've done in regards to with the Wendat. But we see this come up again with the recent, we had our ancestors here recently over the last 6 months at the Peterborough Museum and Archives. And that went alongside the fact that the Prince of Wales in 1860 came and visited. He came to Hiawatha. Gifts were given. There's not a lot of recording on who specifically gave the gifts. We know they were handed over to him, and we obviously got to see some of them come back. But those gifts go alongside that renewal of that relationship, the renewal of our covenant, our chain, and our alliance, as well as that nation-relation relationship. It wasn't simply being given as we thought of him as our king, but rather that it was a gift of trying to renew that and remind them about what our relationship was supposed to be. Some of this full understanding of this hasn't been fully documented. It will be, there is more information that's coming out. There are more pieces of literature, and I believe once I have my dissertation out of the way, I will be writing a paper on this. This understanding can easily also be connected not only to the Royal Proclamation of 1763, but also along with those wampums of Niagara. So when we talk about the Royal Proclamation of 1763, this is what comes together at the end of the 7 Years' War. Well, the 7 Years' War is really the 8 Years' War, because the 7 Years' War, the Royal Proclamation 1763, the Treaty of Versailles, brings about an end to the French-English War, but not the French-Indian allies or the Indigenous allies to the French. We continue fighting with them for a year. So while the Royal Proclamation talks about how England is going to control what it considers its domain, its treaty, or its territory here in North America, and how they're going to control the newly acquired New France. And it talks about how they're going to have to treaty with us to be able to get more territory. The Wampums and Niagara go further with establishing what that relationship was supposed to be. So while the Royal Proclamation kind of makes it look like it's a top-down approach where land can be surrendered and that we're subjects to the crown, the Wampums and Niagara, there's 3 of them, actually outlines that it's supposed to be a nation-nation relationship. It's supposed to be one of understanding and respect, not one of subordination. These two sometimes don't go together. They're not talked about, in a lot of ways. We hear a lot about the 1763, but not so much about 1764, and they are just as important to understanding how that relationship is supposed to be, and what not only many of our ancestors have said, but also what many people have been consistently saying as they've been doing more research on this. John Burroughs has a good piece on this. Next. I wanted to also touch on the Huron. So the Huron, some of the oral history I've heard from some of my interviews, they had approached us back in the 1300s, 1200s to move up to this territory. They had been feuding with one of their main foes, which was the Haudenosaunee then. They asked to come further up. We agreed to allow them to come in, and they were able to settle in the area. And at the time that they were here, when the French came along, that's who they found. That's who they found in the area because they had more semi-permanent settlements. So the French were a little bit more willing to write about that because they had similarities to what the French and how the French lived in Europe. They could see houses, they kind of understood that, they saw crops. Again, with us being along the rivers, we moved around a lot more. What comes with the French? Well, also disease. The disease starts to have an impact. We move further north to avoid the diseases. So again, the writing continues on about the Huron. It looks like it is completely Huron territory because we've gone to the northern half of our territory. The British come along, they're writing mainly about the Haudenosaunee, who have now moved into our area as well by the 1600s because they are looking for resources such as beaver pelts, which is a big component of what we call the beaver wars during the 1600s. But these pictures are quite important because despite this happening and eventually the Huron are kind of forced out, I have seen documentation where the Huron again ask us and the other Anishinaabe nations if they can move further into our territory. And we tell them no. That's when you see them leave the area completely. They go towards Quebec, they go back into the States as well. So there must be something there that if they ask to do that, and we say no, and they completely leave the territory as well. But what is important here is that this picture here, just outside of here, November of 2022? 2021. It is the first time that the Huron Nation met with the Mississauga Nation as nations, not through Canada, since 1813, and that's what the other plaque is for. The last time we met as nations, as sovereign nations, was during the War of 1812 at the Battle of the Thames. We were there together, but we again started to see this movement forward where we're trying to reestablish relations. These are the representatives who come down from Wendake, which is outside of Quebec City, trying to reestablish relations because despite our oral history and some documentation showing that they came later, they do have ancestors here, and there's supposed to be a way to be able to move forward. And obviously establishing good relations is going to help with that. And it goes alongside that long history of both nations, both confederacies, being allies. So that is obviously a work in progress as well. Next. Okay, good. So part of why I say that is, again, the Beaver Wars. I didn't know about this until I started hearing more about it about 5-6 years ago. So Beaver Wars is kind of a period between the 1600s, well, pretty much throughout the 1600s, comes to a close in 1701. There's many different factors that impact this. We see some writing from the French and from the English at the time on this, but it's not fully understand what they're trying to say or how they're trying to reflect it because they come a little bit later after this has already been going on for a while. We know that the Haudenosaunee come up this way because they're looking for beaver pelts because they've exhausted their own beaver in their own territory on the south side of the lake. And by this time, like I said, we've moved further north to avoid disease. We eventually start coming back towards the south part of what we call our territory. And it is a very long-standing war where they are trying to keep the territory that they have moved into, and we're trying to move back into it. At the same time, they are fighting with the Huron. The Haudenosaunee have had their own period of discontent. They have lost population, a lot of people, not only from disease, they've lost territory from settlers coming to what we call the 13 colonies eventually, and from the Dutch coming there. But we also see them having issues with being able to keep their population high, so that's one of the reasons why they also war with the Huron. They're trying to bring and integrate people in. That's one of the ways that a lot of our nations did that. When there was a war, we would still integrate people. So they move over to that, and we see this long-standing feud exist for about 100 years. We have the Peace of Montreal, which is supposed to settle everything, but there is questions about if all of the Haudenosaunee were included in this, or if it was only specifically what we would call today Kahnawake, Kanesatake, and Akwesasne. Because by this time, like I said, there's already been upheaval amongst the Haudenosaunee. You have an offshoot of some who become Catholic. They move to what we would call Quebec now. Those three communities are actually offshoots because of that. They are the Catholic Mohawks and such. And there is some evidence that shows that when we sign agreements of peace, it's mainly been with these communities specifically, or these specific groups of Haudenosaunee. The French and the British are very involved by this time. It doesn't seem like they realize that they're involved with the Beaver Wars, but they are. You know, old world feuds come with new world feuds in a sense. So the British and French already don't get along. The French ally pretty quickly with enemies of the Mohawk, and then when the British come along, it's very simple for them to be able to ally with the Haudenosaunee as well. So that has impact here, and that's why we also become we become very strong allies with the French. We had long-standing feuds with the Haudenosaunee as well. And it spills over during this time. Next. So as we're going forward during this time, and there's still this battle over certain things, 1701, there's a peace. There's still some feuding that goes on. We see, obviously, as I said, the 7 Years' War happen. The French get kicked out. The British start looking for ways to properly show their dominance in the area and try to show their hegemony in this area. So not only does the Royal Proclamation allow for them to start looking at ways to have more land surrendered, which they start pushing for more so by 1783, because at the end of 1783, the American Revolution has ended, the United States of America is formed, and they have a lot of their own subjects who need to come up and out of those colonies because they're now being forced out from that area. They were loyalists. Not only that, but also there are quite a few indigenous allies who also need to move out of their territory. The American Revolution has huge impacts on the Haudenosaunee. Half of them stay and fight with the Americans, while the other half don't. That half that fought for the British are kicked out of their territory, and that's how you get Six Nations, that's how you get Tyendinaga. As this influx happens, we see the British come to us specifically to start having land surrenders. 1781 is the north side, or the western side of the Niagara River. Quickly after that, you have the Crawford, you have Gunshot, you have many that go on. The first Toronto Purchase. They're looking for places where their loyalists, or their subjects who are loyalists can come up. But not only that, you have the Haldimand Tract for the Six Nations that is bought as well. So that way those Haudenosaunee have a place to come. And we agreed to allow it to be sold because we understood what was going on. We wanted them to be okay as well. But what comes with this as well is that with that influx of new people into the area comes a lot of, how do we want to say it? We see a lot of influence of different ways, of different culture. So disease has actually started to impact us as well. A lot of our key people who are very important to how our societies worked are medicine people, our educators, our healers are impacted by this. They die. There is a huge kind of area that no longer is filled by anybody, so we see an influence start to happen with that. And by the early 1800s, you see us convert to Methodism with Peter Jones. Peter Jones converts, and I'll talk a little bit more about that as well. But we also see the New England Company, which is a Methodist organization, start to work with us about establishing our communities. And as I said, 5 of our 6 communities are established through this company. Our communities, we agree to do it this way. We never sign over our communities. Our territorial area does not go to the Crown. We don't actually go through the Indian Act. Our communities, as they originally were established, were villages that we formulated that way. We also start to see those conflicts over purchases and questions about this. The original Toronto Purchase from 1787, if you look for it, there's nothing written. So they had to do it again in 1805. You have the gunshot treaty, which says, obviously, as far as a gunshot can be heard, that's debatable about how far you can hear and depending on what's in the way, as well as the Crawford Purchase talks about how far a man can walk in a day. So there's a lot of questions that revolve around this, and we see that conflict, especially as we talk about the fact that settlers didn't listen to the rules that they're supposed to follow as well. They still keep encroaching into territory, and we keep petitioning the Crown and their representatives to do something about that. So they simply come back with more purchases. And again, like I said, you have this conflict that starts between Methodism and our traditional way, but again, there's people who are looking for ways to be able to handle what's going on at the time. And we see at this time a movement away from us being allies in nation-to-nation relations to one where we start to become in the way of progress. Next. So when I refer to that, a lot of the documentation says that the first person to convert to Christianity is Peter Jones from what we call the Credit now. A couple days before that, his sister actually converts first and then converts him. So that gets left out a lot. So actually it's his sister who actually converts first. It easily is spread amongst our communities because Peter Jones already speaks English and French. I mean, he speaks English and Anishinaabe, so he's able to start relating the Bible to our own stories and our own oral history, as well as our own creation stories. So it quickly moves and gets adopted. In doing interviews and work with the Credit, there are different ways that Peter Jones gets looked at. If you do a lot of his reading, he has his own diary printed. The way that you see him talking about his conversion, like he went through a very hard childhood, he almost died, he was left out to freeze. He writes about how his father went through a drunken situation and did not actually protect him. He almost froze during one winter. So there was a lot of, it seemed to be him connecting that to meaning what it meant to be Indigenous. So he had a lot of anger about that. So he didn't see our traditional way. He thought what he thought was the traditional way was the problem in his mind, but it wasn't actually our traditional way. So when he converted, he saw this as a way of protecting not only the Mississauga, but also a way of being able to live better, because that's how he saw was the best way going forward. So he embraced it, we embraced it, we went forward looking positively. We were considering it as a way of becoming civilized in a sense according to how Europeans wanted it. But we start to see that by the 1840s, we're the wrong Christians. We're not the proper Christians. We're not part of the Church of England. So when we start to see, especially in the Credit here in Hiawatha, we're petitioning to get title because we started to farm. We have started to build houses. We are doing things the way that they expect us to do it. We're trying to live by the same standards as they are. But that by giving us title as well, that prevents them from continuing to move forward and being able to do what they want to in the area. So what comes forward is we start to see documentation that shows that, especially around this time, there's a change in how we're doing diplomacy. No longer is the Indian affairs by Great Britain being done by more the military side, who have had a long-standing of history of working with our nations. This is where you see bureaucracy gets established. It becomes more of a public servant thing. They start to move away from the original approach, and they start to look at us as kind of being in the way of progress, like I said. And therefore, we're not good enough to be able to actually have that title because we're never going to be civilized. No matter how hard we try to do the farming, how much we become Christians and good standing citizens in our own communities, it's not the right Christianity. And this goes alongside, we start to see policies where it comes forward where we're now just kind of in the way of progress, and the best thing is for us to either be isolated and moved further away, so that way we can be protected and be out of the way of progress. So you see a movement away from the church being utilized to help civilize us to where the church can be allowed to be involved with us, and it doesn't matter which church it is. So at this time, you see kind of a break for a bit between the Methodists. So half the communities become Anglican, the other half stay Methodist. Mississauga up in the north becomes Catholic, because that's who gets there first to that community is the Catholic Church. So it becomes a religious free-for-all. This goes alongside, again, like I said, by 1840, you're seeing this mentality. The Bagehot Commission comes out in 1845, which further states this and makes it actual British policy. We are damned if we do, we're damned if we don't. It shows a clear and very specific definition of moving away from nation-to-nation relations and to one where we are lesser than, and therefore calls for further control and tightening of rules relating to us. this is kind of a stepping point to what we see eventually with the Indian Act. At the same time, as I said, we're kind of in the way. This area is becoming very dominated by settlers. So there's a push by the British officials that we should be relocated. Not only up to Manitoulin Island originally, but there's also a push for some of our communities to be moved from where they are. This is when you see what becomes Alderville, moved from Grape Island, which was originally moved from where Kingston is. We have Mississauga the Credit that is moved right from the Credit River, kind of where Port Credit is today, to where it is now, one of the few communities that doesn't have access to water. You have what becomes Scugog, which is moved from Balsam Lake. They are an offshoot from Curve Lake originally as well. But the way that it's written about is that this is kind of our decision, or it's pushed this way, but you can see documentation that goes back 10, 20, 30 years, showing that they were trying to do this, and they wanted this to happen, so they were starting the process early. So although it looks like we choose to do this, there's clear intent, especially with the credit, that they want the credit out of the way because the territory there is viable, and it is worth something to them. And you see this come through with some of the correspondence that is noted and kept recorded by Chief Potash from here, as well as you see from Peter Jones, you see from John Sunday, you see from quite a few of the key figures that are by this time speaking English and able to write in English, communicating for our nation and for our communities. They're pushing back on this and trying to understand why it's being done this way and showing that it's not okay. So this is where coming in and reviewing documents. A lot of it is in very strong cursive, so trying to go through it is quite interesting to try to make sure I'm actually translating it properly. But like I said, even Egerton Ryerson, who is looked at in some ways negative or positive, not only for how the general school board system is established here in Canada, but because of how it relates to residential schools. He is even writing that this should not be done the way it's being done. He has done in trying to support Peter Jones. And you see this documentation strongly not only from the 1820s, but right up to when we see the meetings happening and the discussions over what becomes the Williams Treaties. So in regards to this is just brief. I haven't been able to go through everything, and in reality, stuff to do with this is still forthcoming. There's a lot of literature on this that's not fully been developed yet, and you're seeing more scholars, especially Anishinaabe scholars, talking about this. So we see questions around gender and Anishinaabe views of gender, as well as Two-Spirited being discussed now. Doug Williams, Leanne Simpson, Doug being originally from Curve Lake, Leanne Simpson from Alderville, start writing about this and highlight this in some of their literature. If no one has Doug Williams' book, Michisagig Nishnawbeg, it's a good book to have. It's really interesting to look at. It gives a lot of history, not only for Curve Lake, but for all of our communities and us as a people. Not only from them, but a number of interviews I've had have expressed this, especially older people in the communities have talked about this in regards to the roles that women as well as Two-Spirited people have. When we talk about Two-Spirited, what is coming out on that is that they tend to have had the role of our medicine people, our healers, our spiritual leaders, our educators. So what we have from some of the people who've written about this is what they've been relearning and what they've been going back and listening to some of the older people from our communities talk about, such as Doug Williams. Sorry guys, I keep lowering, I don't mean to. And talking about this. And what has been highlighted from some of these interviews is that obviously, as I said, when the diseases came in, these people were at the front lines. So there wasn't a lot of recording of what existed about them or how they were interacting with our societies. This is starting to come out again, as we see from many different nations. There's a discussion that goes alongside this about a spectrum of genders and what this refers to. I've not gone into enough of this, so please don't ask me questions about this one. There's still a lot of information and research that I'd have to do to look into that. In regards to women, we know that there's a significance of them in our societies, and that has been diluted over history. De facto made illegal in regards to what their traditional roles were in our communities. Traditionally, historically, supposedly, what has been highlighted from some interviews and from some literature is that long time ago it was more maternal, it became patriarchal, or it became paternal, or we inherit a lot of our stuff through our father. There has been some interviews that I've done and from some literature that I've looked at that does highlight that the way that some societies work in regards to clans, and again, this is initial, and I'm Not stating that this is completely the way it is, it's what I've come across, that in the cases where our father wasn't Anishinabeg, you could inherit your mother's clan. And part of that was because looking back at the way things existed in the history, with a small population, there had to be ways of being able to do that, especially reflecting intermarrying. As one interview I had mentioned that, if we had followed the way that we kind of think that we're doing it right now, we should have all been one clan a long time ago. So there's a way of making it still healthy so that way it's still very diverse, especially representative of our different communities. There are some communities where they have the white spruce, they have plants as their clans, and there are some communities like ourselves that have more animals. But I think in ours, I've seen one of the documentation where it looks like there's a stick as well, so I don't know if there's referring to plant, one from like 1818. So there's discussion about this, but this is up for this is up for more of a conversation with more of the elders who know more about this, and this is what I'm trying to reach out for this. So I get very nervous talking about both of these because people can get feel very personal about it because of what we've learned over time. Next, okay. So in regards to kind of what I was talking about, what I've seen come across some of the stuff is obviously an importance of our relationship and our place in not only the 7 Years' War, or the 8 Years' War as we want to call it, but also the American Revolution. We have impact there, we're very involved. The War of 1812 is another one. How the Canadian Confederation and the implementation of the Indian Act has impact. Residential schools, how they've impacted us as well. The building of the Trent Severn Waterways and Williams Treaties, they've had strong and very significant impact on not only our community, but our nation as a whole and our territory. We see from the 1960s to the 1980s, redevelopment in community. We see a rebirth in a sense. We start to see more of autonomy given back again, or us taking it, however you want to look at it. But we also see at this time the impact of the 60 scoop. There's still residential schools having an impact. Some of our communities are still having kids taken, and we know that there's a lot of people who are taken during the 60 scoop as well. But we see moving and going, as well as going in regards to land claim processes. We see the start in the late 60s, early 70s, especially with what happens out west. We start to push back as well. Going forward, we also see from what I've seen from interviews and talking with some of our community members and members of our nation, you see a resurgence in language, culture, and traditions and identity, especially from the late 80s, 90s on, depending on, well, say for all the southern communities, that's very much the case for all the southern ones. Economic development and re-entrenching autonomy over various areas of jurisdiction, such as education and children. And especially recently, we're seeing a lot more youth get involved with harvesting again, hunting, trapping, wanting to understand fishing practices that reflect very important ways of doing things from the Mississauga Anishinaabe perspective, again, because we are the fishing people. And a lot of this, especially for the 4 communities in the area, comes because of the reestablishment of and recognition that we did not give up our hunting and fishing and harvesting rights with the Williams Treaty. And of course, we are seeing the reestablishment of our totems, our clans. People are starting to relearn this, especially as we go over documentation, see the different signatures that go alongside names. This can be difficult. I have seen for Cowies, it goes Cowies to cow with an E to KOW, and then it gets to a point where there's no cow at all. So I know from my family lineage, I'm able to get to almost the signing of the rights like purchase, but then I can't make the connection to Hanson Jack Cow. Hopefully you can help me with that. Like literally I have in my own documents for myself, I have there's 2 lines where I just have question marks between, there's 2 generations that I'm missing at the moment. But what also comes out from these interviews, which I found very interesting, is every single interview from any of our members has talked about the importance of gardening and sharing. It has been a key thing for a long time. Access to waterways being very important. Our access to having the ability to utilize our water systems, very key. And that's not just from those interviews, but that goes right back to the 1700s. As well as the harvesting, wild rice, and obviously harvesting our maple sap. These are very key, and we see those coming back and a lot more of it being introduced. And I've seen pictures, obviously, over the years of how that's been reestablished here on Rice Lake with our youth as we see people doing ice fishing and taking advantage of the fact that they are able to do that again without having to worry about hiding or running away because of M&R. Alongside this, there we go. So I just started this back in October when I came back into the position. There was a 6-month period where I had to stop doing the research work. So I've also started doing a timeline. I have no problem sharing this timeline. I can pass it along to the community so that way it can be shared. It is a work in progress. There are some things I have to go back and add to this timeline because of the 3 years of work I've already done on it. But this shows a whole bunch of periods and important, significant events that we have been involved with as a nation, whether it has been the war over the Austrian succession. We had a huge impact on that despite not being in Europe. To the establishment of our communities, as well as obviously to the signing of the Williams Treaty. But I will have no problem handing that out. But this is one of the other things that I've started doing is keeping a timeline just to show the long history we have there. And there's things that we have been very much involved with or had impact on that many of us may not know. Very important world events that I didn't even have a clue. So, next. Yeah, there's the other part of it. I've been updating it already today too. Next. So, in the last part that I'm going to kind of highlight as well, in regards to the timeline continued. So, while I'm talking about all this stuff, there we go. I'm highlighting those important things that our nation and our communities have done, but I'm also trying to highlight that we've never given up on all that stuff. Our nation-to-nation relationship, our importance of our treaties, the importance of those wampums from 1764. That goes on right up until even this past summer, when there was a political delegation of Mississauga who went over to England and met with the king. So you see in that middle picture, the former chief from Mississauga and the former chief from the Credit, and Councillor Steve Toms from Curve Lake meeting with King Charles. I was fortunate enough to be asked to go on behalf of our community. I am out of the picture focus. If you notice, they're wearing ribbon shirts. I wore a suit and tie. I think I made that mistake, and I think they thought I was the assistant. So I'm not in the picture, but as you can see, I was involved. So Steve and I got to do a presentation on the importance of the wampums from 1764 to a delegation on the Isle of Man. And the other picture on the other side is with that delegation. We met with the High Commissioner for Canada to the United Kingdom, Ralph Goodall in the corner down there. We have the chiefs again with one of the people who helped us do this event. He's in charge of the Royal Chapter and is kind of the right-hand person to King Charles. It is through him that we were able to actually meet with King Charles at this garden party. And then the chiefs really got interested with the guy in the top, within the normal kind of British hat. So they wanted a picture with that. And then at the end of this delegation, we had Nathan Tildridge, who helped formulate this. He helped design these medallions to go alongside the fact that for many years, especially from 1764 on, traditionally the British have done medallions as a sign of doing relationships and doing that diplomacy with our nation and other nations. And we see that happen. You see that from us fighting in the War of 1812. You see this from us supporting the British during the American Revolution. You see this whenever we sign agreements with them as well. This is one of the things that they hand over a part of that diplomacy. So in doing with that, these were designed to commemorate July of 2023, showing again the reestablishment of that covenant, the reestablishment of that nation-to-nation relationship, and that it has not disappeared and it was never gone. I got asked what my students thought of me by him. That's all he asked. So with my conclusion, I just want to highlight this quote from Doug Williams. Mississauga Nishnabeg means the people that live in the mouths of river. Mississauga Nishnabeg is used to describe our people in the notes of the Treaty of 1701 in Montreal and appears on a map done by British cartographers in the 1700s. It is used in the journals of the Jesuits. So we see that there's documentation about us going back into the 1600s, and it is well documented. But again, it comes about as we move back into our territory and as we are fighting with the Haudenosaunee. It's important to remember that component for us. With that, I just want to say miigwech. Thank you to obviously the nation, our community, but also just to highlight the Stephen Lowe Foundation that helped to make today possible, and for helping with the funding to go and meet with the king as a political delegation, which was the first time since 1860. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Chad. Great presentation, and I just had a a couple of comments I wanted to make on this as Chad was chatting. First, yes, Chimigwech to the Stephen Lau Foundation. They help sponsor the Mississauga Nations to go over to England. And that was through the work with Chief Laforme and getting that all arranged. And we thought it best for Chad as our researcher to be able to go and attend and do that research for us so that we can continue this work that we're doing right now. And also something that may be of interest to Sheryl and to Chad is we just recently had a records book returned. It was found and returned to us from, the minutes go from 1928 to 1939. And in there, and you were talking about the hunting in Chad and the trapping, and in there, one of the discussions and the decision was to purchase serpent mounds. 4 reasons: hunting, the beavers that were there, the rice, and our ancestors. So I just wanted to, when it was returned, I read it. I read all the old minutes a long time ago, and then when this was returned, I read those, and I find them very interesting of how our men governed the community. You could still see that sense of who they were as Anishinaabe and that people while trying to fight that colonism and moving forward. And one part was giving that when they would lease the non-native person, they gave them the privilege, and that's what they wrote. We give you the privilege to live here with us. And so it was really interesting to find how strong our people were and how they still were fighting that way. So I just wanted to point that out. And so thank you, Chad, that was awesome. Sheryl, we'll take a 5-minute break, but just so you know, we do have containers. Thank you, Katie, for getting them. If anyone wants to take any of this food home, we're going to bring the containers out. Please help yourself and have a break. Thank you. Miigwech. Next on for our evening, we have Sheryl Dundas, who is going to be talking about family histories. And Sheryl has done a lot of work in, I'd like to say, a book of knowledge on our family history, and one of my go-to people when I need to know these things, and really greatly appreciate the work that she does. Again, the work Chad does, because a lot of us, or myself, is that I'm not the researcher, I'm not the person looking into that, but I love to learn and I love to know this information. And so I want to say Chimigwech to Sheryl for coming out tonight and being part of this evening and sharing all her information with us. Chimigwech, Sheryl.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Anin, Sheryl and Dijnakas. Hello, Sheryl is my name. My presentation tonight will share some of the research that I've done, but it will also include some stories about how I researched. And for those of you that haven't seen them, I did put a few boards at the back that have additional information on them. I created these boards in 2007, and they're still in really good shape today, so I put them out. So today's presentation is on our families. Next. In the early 2000s, I was given a family tree on my dad's side. This is my grandfather, Ivan Fletcher, out of Keene, and he had a bus company down there. And this 128-page document had myself in it, my husband, my kids, my siblings, and it was all typewritten. And I thought, wow, someone has put a lot of work into this. And I wanted to know more about my mom's indigenous side, so I started to research. My mom was a huge help when I first started to research. She would give me hints such as, well, your Aunt Sue drowned in Rice Lake when Charla was a baby. Oh, well, kind of tells me when to research. Or she told me that my grandmother, Viola Johnson, lost her father, her brother, and her father-in-law within 3 months of each other. So listening to relatives certainly helped in my early research. In the beginning, I only researched my mother's family. Her name was Lana Beverly Howard. So I only looked for Howard people. And one day I was at the library, and I happened to come across Elizabeth Muskrat's obituary. You can imagine my surprise. This was in 1933. Elizabeth Muskrat's maiden name was Howard. It was like, oh my gosh, I am missing so many people in my family tree because I'm only looking for the name Howard. So then I started to look for anyone from Hiawatha. But Hiawatha people married into Curve Lake, Alderville. Boy, this was getting complicated really fast. So then I started to research Alderville and Curve Lake. And, sorry. So after, I decided to research those 3 reserves because my grandfather was from Hiawatha, Madden Howard. My grandmother was from Curve Lake, Viola Johnson, and Grampy's mother was from Alderville. So I did have relatives on all 3 reserves. So I bought a family tree program, and I started putting in all kinds of births and death dates, and then someone would say to me, well, how did they die? Well, I don't know. I didn't document that. So I started typing every obituary that I came across related to the reserves, and it is in my family file. Next. Today, my family file has almost 40,000 people in it. So, a funny story. I was once really excited one night because I was approaching 2,000 people in my file, and I said to my husband, I'm like, Bob, I just came across a family tree on the internet, and it has 12,000 people. And he looks at me and says, "They must be divorced." But when I call it my family tree file, it is my family tree file, but it includes my stepdad, Lee's family. It includes Gary's family, my brother-in-law. It includes people that I worked with, their families. I'm reading the newspapers anyway, so I might as well document them. So I've helped many people research their families. I've helped many people solve issues, problems, mysteries, such as my stepdad, Lee. He was trying to get a birth certificate. And on the application, you have to give your mother's maiden name. Well, pretty much everyone knows their mother's maiden name. So Lee writes it down, sends the application away, comes back, denied. That's not what it says on your birth certificate. And he says, "Well, my mother's name is Robinson." And so he asked me for help. And so we made multiple phone calls. And, sorry, my screen, I just touched a button. We made multiple phone calls, and we said, "Okay, what does it say on the brother that was born before him for mother's maiden name? Robinson? But that's not what it says on Lee's. Oh, what does it say on the marriage or the birth certificate for the brother born after him? Robinson? But that's not what it says on Lee's." So we tried everything. His mother was French. His father was Scottish. This is the address he lived at when he was born. And they're like, "Yep, all those things are correct, but it's not the right maiden name." Make a long story short, I got this really nice guy on the phone. He says, "I'm going to send you the certificate. I can tell he is who you say he is, but it's just too bad you didn't know it says McMullen on his." So I said to Lee, "Who's McMullen?" "Oh, that's my dad's mom." So his dad filled out the application, and when it said, "Who's your mother's maiden name?" he put his. So not all the documents you come across are going to be 100% accurate. So, next. In the past presentations, I've spoken about James Spaniard, a member of Hiawatha, who was hunting in Kinmount with James Shipigo of Alderville. Robert English from Burnt River mistook him for a bear and shot and killed him. 4 years later, Robert English shot and killed his own son, mistook him for a woodchuck. So the newspapers up in Lindsay area were saying, perhaps he should lay down his gun. I've spoken about Ben Howard. Ben Howard was a runner, and in 1908, Ben Howard was my grandfather's brother. But I didn't know about him until I started to research, probably because when Ben died, my grandfather was only 3. So Ben was a long-distance runner, often running road races from Lakefield to Hiawatha, or to Peterborough, rather. And some say he was practicing running from Peterborough to Hiawatha along the railroad tracks in 1908 when he was run over by a train, and he was killed. So he was identified by a postcard in his pocket. We've had drownings for some of our family members. Jack Muskrat drowned in 1913. Peter Rice Lake drowned in 1867. Joseph Laux and Sarah Crawford, they had 5 children. Only 4 of them had status. 1 son did not. I came across a letter in the archives dated 1901, and I have highlighted the areas. It specifically says Sarah Anderson, she had remarried by this time. Her son John Laux, not a member of any band of Indians. Her son Joseph Laux, a member of the Rice Lake Band of Indians. So I'd be very curious to know, 2 sons, why only one had status and one didn't. Next, back. Murders. We've had murders. My grandfather's brother, William Howard, father of Ron Howard Sr., a residential school survivor, and his brother Bill. He was murdered in Lindsay in 1943, and in 1949, a descendant of the John Lugs that I told you that didn't have status, his son was also murdered, ironically in Lindsay as well. Next. In 1850, there was a membership list that we found in the archives. And at that time, you'll notice we had 4 chiefs down here. So it took 4 of them to do the job of Lori Carr, I guess. That membership list, I hold it in my hand. I just typed it up for ease to show it to you, but it's 3 pages long if anyone wants to look at it. Next. In 1864, in the paper, there was an article, this is the Coburg paper, there's an article on how George and David Cowie, 2 Indians formerly of Rice Lake, convinced 4 young people from Hiawatha to go to the United States to collect herbs. And they were going to make $36 a month. When they got them to Rochester, they apparently sold them to the U.S. Army for $1,000 each. And their names were Brooking Crow, Augustus Potash, Erastus Charcoal, and Peter Simon. The next article in 1865, also from Coburg, states that Augusta Potash died from typhoid fever, and they didn't know where the other 3 men were. So Robert Brooking Crow did come back, and he drowned in Otonabee River in 1890. Peter Simon came back, and he's in the Hiawatha census for 1871. And Erastus Charcoal, I think he may have been Erastus Anderson, but called Erastus Charcoal because his mother married a man named Charcoal. Next. And could you hit it one more time? So James Spaniard Cowie, here's where the Cowie comes in. He married Mary Hagerman from Port Hope in 1905, and they had 5 girls. In 1914, 2 of them died of a diphtheria. And then I saw that James also died in 1914, and I thought, wow. And so I looked into his death. This house here, I took a drive on Sherbrooke Street because I looked at the city directories for Peterborough, and this is actually the house that James Cowie's family lived in on Sherbrooke Street. That's not the car they were driving. Next. James Cowie was hit by a train as well in 1914. And for those of you that have gone down Monaghan below where Sears was, you'll see a train crossing called Crawford Trail. That's where he was hit by a train. The train was a half an hour late coming from Lindsay, and so they crossed, probably not expecting it, when they were hit. James's wife, Mary, did not remarry, but in 1951, her and 2 of her brothers died from fumes from their furnace. They were asphyxiated in their home. And next. And today they are buried at Little Lake Cemetery. And ironically on this stone, it says that Nona, who died in 1908, she's buried in Little Lake Cemetery as well. But her death notice in the paper said that she was buried at Hiawatha. So I'm not sure. Next. Having been through the pandemic recently, we know how it affected families and friends. And in 1916, the Crow family, Chief Alfred Crow, his family was affected by bronchial pneumonia. His wife, Angelina Tobacco from Curve Lake, she died the middle of April. And a week later, 2 of her children, Kenneth and Evelyn, they passed away from the same thing. 8 other family members were also sick. And the bottom, or in this article, it says that they were taken to the hospital by ambulance, and it was a 3-hour round trip to go to Peterborough. So next. So this is the war papers for Robert Anderson. And he was from World War I. And Robert Anderson was killed overseas, and Hiawatha in 1937 rededicated the hall in his honor, and they called it Memorial Hall. And I was talking or emailing with Brian Potash one day, and Brian said to me, "Do you know what happened to his wife?" I said, "His wife? He was only in England 3 months." I said, "I didn't know he had a wife." So I went online and I looked. Over in England, I could find records that if you put in names and a period of time, it might come up with a match. So I put in the 3-month period that Robert English had been in England, or Robert Anderson had been in England. And Louis, because I knew his wife's name was Louis, because Brian Potash researches war veterans, and he knew that the widow collected a pension. So that's how he knew that there was a wife. So anyway, I found a match that could possibly be it, but you only have like a date. Doesn't have any details. So I went to this website. Next. Oh, sorry. That's fine. Stay there. So in 2008, the hall was rededicated, Memorial Hall in Robert's memory, and I just thought it was an amazing thing. So we have Jack Cowie, Wally Laux, Bob Cowie, Bev Cowie, and Ron Howard Sr. unveiling, our veterans unveiling the new plaque. So next. Now, this back to Robert Anderson's marriage. I went to this website called Random Acts of Genealogical Kindness. This is a website of people who volunteer in their area to help you find information. You don't have to pay for their time. You'd simply pay for photocopying costs, or if, because it's normally in their area, you don't have to pay for gas or anything like that. So I found a volunteer in England in the district that this marriage had occurred at. And while I had never really paid for research before, I paid $20 Canadian through PayPal to get the following. Next, Robert Anderson's marriage certificate. So the top line, Robert Anderson, 21, he was a bachelor. His father was Andrew Anderson, and Andrew Anderson was deceased, and Andrew had deceased before in 1905. And Louis Hamblin was a spinster, and so anyway, it is nice to have a record through Random Acts of Genealogical Kindness. And next. In 2019, I was very curious about why the Herkimer brothers would come to a little Indian village like Hiawatha from Herkimer, New York. So Bob and I took a road trip, and we decided to go down there. Herkimer is about an hour away from Cooperstown, where the Baseball Hall of Fame is. So Bob said, we'll do a round trip. We'll do Herkimer, then we'll do the Baseball Hall of Fame. So I said, okay. So the night before, we're in the hotel room in Herkimer, and I wanted to go to the Herkimer Historical Society. So Bob said to me, he said, well, you can have 15 minutes at the Historical Society. This coming from a man who never researched. So I said to him, oh, okay, I can make that work. You can have 15 minutes at the Baseball Hall of Fame. And he looked at me and he said, well, you want to go to the Baseball Hall of Fame too, don't you? No, not really. So the picture on the right, this historical society was in a doctor's office, but it was a house. And there was an old well out back, and they had been excavating the well. And all these, I wished I'd have taken a picture. This is from their website. But this cabinet is full of medicine bottles and thermometers and all the things that they dug out of this well. And that kept Bob entertained for well over an hour so that I could research. When we were down there, I did buy a book, and it's the Mohawk Valley Herkimers and Allied Families. And in here it does say, give an idea of how the Herkimers came to leave the U.S. It had to do something, I'm not the Revolutionary War type person, but it had something to do with that, I think. So Dad was put in jail. Dad escaped to Canada, but they put his family in jail. And then there was a prisoner escape, so the family came to Canada as well. And actually, the Herkimers, a lot of them went to Kingston. And while I was there, I left a copy of Gail Nelson's Herkimer research up here. So it was a win-win for all of us. Next. The Honor and Respect Project. I hope many of you got to go to the museum and see them. It was truly an honor to be involved in this project. The part I played was I did research on the women who made the baskets, and I'm holding Hannah McHugh's basket. And my great-grandfather was married 3 times. Hannah McHugh, her daughter was his second wife. So I come down through the 3rd wife. So I'm kind of closely related to her. And I had a privilege, Michelle and I had a privilege of making a pair of birch bark and quill earrings with Sandra Moore. And the piece at the right has the picture of the chiefs. It has the legacy quill piece that Sandra Moore went around and had people put quills in. And what I really loved about this setup when you went into the museum was the water from Rice Lake, the soil from our territory, the 4 medicines, sage, tobacco, cedar, and sweetgrass. It just was such a nice setup. And in case I forget to tell you, I've recently discovered Barry Moore is my 4th cousin. I found a picture of his dad in the newspaper, and when his dad was 6, so I took it when I went to Sanders one day, and I saw Barry, and I'm like, oh, here's a picture of your dad when he's 6. And Barry's kind of looking at me like, how would you know who my dad was? And I said, oh, well, I research people from Warsaw because I'm a descendant of Littles in Warsaw. And Barry goes, so am I. So while the ancestors were here, I really wanted to visit them 13 times, once for each ancestor. So the opening day was my first visit, and the last day was my 13th visit. So I managed to do that, and the traveling ceremony was a +1. It was my 14th visit. Next. Reverend John N. McGalbo Johnson. He was the first Native American to be made a minister of the Episcopal Church in the United States. But John Johnson was actually from Hiawatha. So I went on the web to find a grave. If you haven't heard about Find a Grave, it's volunteers. I like volunteers. It's volunteers, and they go around to cemeteries and they photograph headstones and they post them online that anyone can go in and download the pictures. So I downloaded N. McGalbo's cross, his headstone, and the saying on the right. The picture of him in the middle is also from Find a Grave. So sometimes if they have extra information, they'll add it. But in the archives, there are 2 letters from N. McGalbo. From N. McGalbo to his nephew, Robert Potash. Next. So this first one is dated 1894, and you can see it's from White Earth, and that is where N. McGalbo is buried. And the gist of, and it's signed, so on the right, you can see it's addressed to Robert Potash, dear nephew. And on the left at the bottom, it's signed JJ for the Johnson name and N. McGalbo. And in one of the letters, it states that Robert's father and N. McGalbo, on his last visit, were going across the ice on Rice Lake to the boat maker on the other side. And Robert's dad said to N. McGalbo, you know, you've done your work. You've been away from home long enough. Maybe it's time you come back. And I'll help you build a little frame house. I'll ask the government for a small pension for you. And N. McGalbo says, I thank you for your welcome proposition, but your aunt would never leave her country. And so they're buried at White Earth. Next. The Elders Conference in August was my very first Elders Conference. And let me tell you, I learned so much, and I had a wonderful time. So, before the Elders Conference was in Sault Ste. Marie. That was an 8-hour drive. And Lance, Michigan, the Pinery Cemetery, where I wanted to do some research, was just another 4 hours into Michigan. So guess where I went? So I went to the cemetery looking for Wesley Blaker and family. I did not find them. Wesley Blaker was from Alderville. His first wife was Victoria Weetung from Curve Lake, and she passed away. In 1891, Wesley is living in Alderville, and he has a house. He's widowed, and he has a housekeeper, and her name is Eliza Beatty. So Eliza Beatty, Eliza Irons from Curve Lake married William Beatty. Maybe that's her. So that was in 1901, or 1891. In 1901, they're living in the United States, in Lance, Michigan, and Wesley Blaker now has a wife, Eliza. I wonder if he married the housekeeper. So I just couldn't. I found no marriage for them, either in Canada or Michigan. While I believed with all my heart, because the ages were approximate, that he probably did marry Eliza Irons Beatty, but I couldn't prove it. But when I was at the cemetery, because I have found their obituaries online, so I do know they're buried in this cemetery. But a lot of the headstones, the middle picture, the third picture over, those are spirit houses, and you find them on a lot of the graves down there. And while the family may know who's buried in that place, there's no headstones or anything to indicate who's buried there. So as time passed, on the far right is another one, but it does have more information on who's buried there. It has a birth date, a death date painted on the house, has a picture of the gentleman, his name. So, but back to the elders conference. Man, oh man, that was fun. So Murray and Dory, we had an evening where dinner was on our own. So Murray and Dory invited us to their room. Murray, incidentally, won eldest male at the elders conference. So we have the eldest man inviting a whole group of people to his room. And there were questions asked about relationships and who's related to who. And I said, well, I'll just go back to my room and I'll get my computer, because I don't travel far without it. So I went and got my computer, and we had so much fun just putting in names and how are they related and whatnot. So Shane, my brother, he says to me, and I have spoken to Shane. Shane has given me permission to tell this story. So Shane says to me, he's like, Sheryl, put in me and put in this girl's name. He said, I once dated her. He said, and Graham was not very nice to her. And he said, after I took the girl home, I came back and I said to Graham, you weren't very nice to her. And she said, Sonny, you're related. So I looked it up, and Shane and the girl were cousins. So, but back to Dory and Murray's room, we all had pizza, we ordered in wings, and it was just a wonderful time to spend with people you don't normally spend a lot of time with. So, Elders Conference was wonderful. Next. Next. So this is the 1931 census, and for people that know me, know I get really excited when the censuses are released. Censuses are done every 10 years, and they give you so much information. They give you ages, whether people are married. They give you relationships. They tell you what they do for a living. They tell you if there's been a death within the last year in the family. So this 1931 census, my favorite question on it is in this, oh no, can you go back? My notes must be wrong. Oh no, sorry. I jumped ahead. Next. So I told you how I went to Michigan to find Wesley Blaker and Eliza Irons, whether she was married or not. Oh, go back. So if you look at this, I don't know if you'll be able to see my red dot. Can you see it? Joseph Wheatung married Charlotte Blaker, and Charlotte's mother's name was Eliza Irons. I found this online sitting at my computer 2 weeks ago. I could have saved a lot of gas. And now next, please. So this is the census. This is what really makes me excited. So this column right here, I'll get my little pointer again. This is my favorite question. This column right here, 1931. Does your family own a radio? It was really, really important. And I'm pleased to say Madden Howard's family did. Next. Lastly, what I would like to say is I did up this map quickly. This just shows where some of our members live. I would love to see a map in the Life Center somewhere that indicates where our members live. It doesn't have to be so specific to city or town, just to show how far and wide our roots reach. So, and lastly, I had a coworker who, like my family, have listened to my stories for 20 plus years. And he said to me, he said, Mondays are my favorite day of the week. I'm like, you like Mondays? He said, that's the day you come into my office and tell me your weekend research stories. He said, I love Mondays. Next. Miigwech.
Miigwech, Sheryl, that was wonderful, and always love and appreciate the humor. Thank you. We'll have to tell Shane to behave from now on. So does anyone have any questions for Sheryl or Chad? I'm also have my phone here because I'm looking online to see if anyone has any questions. You do have, for Sheryl and Chad, you have many Chi-miigweches, and we have members watching from New Brunswick, and I see Nova Scotia. So Miigwech, Ernie, and Shannon for joining us from all that way. And so far, no questions online. Does anyone have any in the room? Oh, excellent presentations, you guys. Oh, 1 second.
Sorry, either one of you, if you can respond to this. I'd understood that people with a Native background weren't always allowed necessarily to go for legal recourse when they had some wrongs done. And I was curious when that changed. Because in the 80s, we do see a lot of legal challenges. Prior to that, I don't hear much.
So it depends on certain areas and it depends on treaty areas. For us, you start to see that start to happen. Sorry, too close. You start to see that happen, obviously, with the Indian Act in 1876. What we see Canada and the colonies doing before that is when they're trying to convince us to become more like them, they start doing little policies like the Gradual Civilization Act, which is, we'll give them reason to feel like they should. They're going to want to because they want to be like us. And between 1857 to 1876, one person chose to do that. So then it became requirement to do that. So you see with the Indian Act in 1876, they put in a whole bunch of rules, but it's not, certain things aren't forced yet. You don't see until the 1920s where they completely outlaw our traditional governance structures, and they actually take over. So if we nominated Robert Potash back in the day, because he's a hereditary chief, they could have came and said, no, he's not allowed to be there anymore. They can just automatically axe him and prevent him from running. Around the same time this happens, you see some of our hereditary structures trying to get together and talk with other communities and other nations. And you see this happening in the 20s. There's a group meeting that happens in Six Nations, and a bunch of them get rounded up. And we see this happen in the 20s. And not too long after the Williams Treaty, especially As we see from the Williams treaties, we have a lawyer that we're working with trying to help work with us, and he's pushing for us to make sure things are recognized. It doesn't go very well. Obviously, we see how they do the Williams treaties. They come to us with an idea of what they want us to already sign anyways before they come talk to our communities. So by 1927, they make it illegal for us to use any legal recourse. And part of that's because after World War I, you see the Haudenosaunee and some other nations pushing to have a seat at the League of Nations. You see us pushing back against Canada, having certain things recognized and trying to push for more of their own recognition as being the legitimate entity here. So how do they do that? They make sure that we're not allowed to see lawyers. How do we do that? We remove women from being able to have the positions that they do in our communities, because that's how the whole structure comes down. If they're not there, we're not allowed legal recourse. They can continue to put in laws and excommunicate a bunch of us and take the children away. So you see from the 1920s up until just after World War I, this process. After World War II. After World War II, you have a lot of Canadians alongside us in the trenches, in battle, and they're starting to realize that there's not that much difference, and what they might believe doesn't necessarily actually reflect what is the truth, that there's not much difference. And prior to this period of time, there wasn't a lot of interaction because there wasn't allowed to. Because like I said, not only is it illegal for us to be represented by lawyers, but it's also illegal for us to pretty much leave without permission. So the men can't go out of the community without permission from the Indian agent. A woman can't even leave, not only without permission from the Indian agent, but must also have a male escort, because they're going to, potentially utilize their abilities to lead good Christian men down a path of wrongdoing. So after World War II, there starts to be this push even from some Canadians that we should be citizens. We have and should have the same rights as Canadians. But they're forgetting that history of what that relationship's supposed to be as well. And so the lack of legal recourse also prevents this. And you don't start to see a push against this and where legal recourse starts to come in our benefit until the Calder case in 1973, where they have just decided, the courts have come down and said, title may not be extinguished in all cases, and therefore that's where we see land claim processes start, and where we start to see a movement forward where legal recourse is able to be done again, communities start using lawyers again because they can, and then moves into the 80s with the Constitution Act, and there's a whole debate there. I have a whole class on this, so I'm not going to go into it more than that. But there's a lot there that goes on, but it is to, again, control us and to deconstruct our own structures and make sure who they want in place is in place. We could technically, we could nominate the garbage can against Lori in this community, because anything can pretty much run for chief in a community. Yeah. So some communities have elected a plant as a way of showing the ridiculousness of how the structure exists. But that's because these laws are put in place to have control over us. And when we're using the legal structure, whose legal structure are we using? So yes, we're allowed legal representation, but there's still, I would argue, from my own research and my own work that I do in academia, it's still a top-down and very Canadian-centric point of view without considering our own structures. And from our history, we haven't given up certain components of how we existed. We never gave them up in treaty. They were just simply unilaterally made illegal. Sorry.
Any other questions? I'm just going to check online while we're... No, I don't see any questions online, but I do again see many people saying thank you, great job, and that they're learning so much, and to be able to have more of these events. So wonderful, thank you. Just a couple comments before we close down. I wanted to say when, again, reading that minute book, and it did talk a lot about they were all male members of the reserve at the meeting. Just so you know, it said they wanted to hire the male to clean. I'm just saying. And the only woman ever mentioned in that book was Mrs. Potash as the organist through those 11 years. So it was really, it's very, very interesting to read those and the way the political business was done back then. So in closing, also, sorry, one more thing. I did mention this to Sheryl, and Chad was there. During the visit to the Black River, we also went to Saget Harbor. Saget Harbor? Yeah. And they are doing a anniversary this year, and they have mention of 18 of our Mississauga men down there during the War of 1812. So we're going to be in touch with the lady at Saget Harbor and to see when this anniversary is, and perhaps there's an event that we can do or take a bus down or do something to be a part of that. And I know Chad was, and Sheryl would probably very much like to know those men if they have those names. So it's really good to make connections and to see where our people were and where they fought and what they did to protect us as Mississauga Nation, but our home and our communities. So again, Chi-miigwech, and to everyone online, I just want to say thank you so much. Appreciate you spending this time with us. And to Eugene up there in that window, Eugene, thank you. Well done, and always appreciated. Miigwech, Eugene. So again, thank you to Lonnie, who helped us organize, and Trish, who couldn't be here tonight, and to everyone for coming out. Thank you, and to the Stephen Lau Foundation for sponsoring this for us, and we will ensure that we do this again, so you guys got to get busy. Anyway, Chi-miigwech, thank you, and thank you everyone online.